Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jennifer Fields, and I'm the facilitator of the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as the Climate Ready Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you would like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, on our website. These links can be found on the registration email and in follow-up emails. Today's presentation will follow the Tomales Bay Living Shorelines Feasibility Project. The study is assessing where living shorelines in Tomales Bay can provide multi-benefits, including flood and erosion protection from impacts of sea level rise, support vibrant recreational opportunities, and help restore healthy ecological systems. We will hear from Leslie Lacko and Dane Behrens. Leslie is a senior planner for the Marin Community Development Agency and has extensive experience with innovative climate change adaptation and sea level rise policy with work with the State Coastal Conservancy, the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and the Alameda Resource Conservation District. Dane Behrens is a coastal engineer and geomorphologist working for Environmental Science Associates, where he is specializing in long-term adaptation and management of coastal lagoons and estuaries in California. A little bit about webinar logistics. We will listen and watch their presentation for about 40 minutes and follow with a Q&A session. During their talk, if you would like to submit questions, please do so by using the chat box. I will collect, review, and read the questions, and Leslie and Dane will respond. This webinar will be recorded and available for review after the webinar. And with that, I will happily pass the virtual mic to Leslie and Dane.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off the presentation today by putting the Tomales Bay Living Shoreline Feasibility Project in the context of Marin County's overall sea level rise planning program, and also talking about our public outreach strategies, well, our project outreach strategies, I should say. So here we go. First, I'll put it in the context of where is Tomales Bay, right? Tomales Bay is in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco, here, across the Golden Gate Bridge. It's this finger of water that comes down here. This is actually a map that shows the San Andreas Fault and other fault lines in the Bay Area, but I thought it was pretty useful for this, especially since the Bay is right on the fault. So Tomales Bay is bordered by Point Reyes National Seashore here, and the Golden Gate National Recreation Area extends from the lower part down this way. It's one of the most beautiful spots in the state. I'm a little biased, but that's what I think. And you know, it's got great swimming, crystal clear water. It's warm in the summer. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's got a huge tourism industry, and one of the major attractions is oysters, eating oysters and oyster aquaculture. This is a picture down here from Hog Island Oyster Company. One of the other things about the Tomales Bay shoreline in terms of planning for sea level rise is that it's bordered on the east by Highway 1, and in some locations the highway runs very close to the shoreline. So here you see this stretch of highway, there's a home, a little embankment, and the water is right there. And on the west side, the shoreline is bordered by Sir Francis Drake Highway. So this situation is present in on both sides of the bay. Now, Marin County's sea level rise planning program on the west side is called CSMART. I won't tell you what that acronym stands for. But it started out when the county was updating its local coastal program, which is a requirement by the California Coastal Commission. And our planning manager, Jack Leapster, quickly recognized that we needed more information about how the coast would be impacted by sea level rise. They got funding for a vulnerability assessment of the coast and an adaptation report. In the process of all of this planning that would fit into our local coastal program, they did a lot of public outreach, and they developed some really strong and lasting relationships with the public in West Marin. And those really help us to this day with our sea level rise planning. So what we left with was these great relationships and also an adaptation report that identified a lot of different strategies that would be possible along the shoreline. It wasn't an adaptation plan, though. It was an identification of strategies. This is just a slide that I pulled that shows some of the outreach activities that we've engaged in as a county for sea level rise education. Shrinking Shores is a program where we go out to specific locations and actually show where sea level rise will be in the future. So you can see here with the flag showing sea level rise in 2030. This is at Stinson Beach. We also have the game of floods that we use with the public, where they play a game and they learn how to apply adaptation strategies in this make-believe world to save their threatened communities. And then we also had the Youth Exploring Sea Level Rise Science program. After CSMART did the vulnerability assessment, the county realized we needed to do the same for the bay side, which is where there's a lot of infrastructure, most of the infrastructure in Marin County. So a vulnerability assessment was done there. CSMART and Baywave and all the staff that work on those, it's two different departments, and we all work closely together because we have this large body of knowledge now that we share really to make sea level rise planning possible in Marin County. What followed the vulnerability assessment was this adaptation framework report. I think Dane will talk a little bit more about that. But basically what this report is Point Blue and San Francisco Estuary Institute worked with Marin County to take the work from the Adaptation Atlas that SFEI developed and develop a methodology for how you apply that work in specific locations. And in this report, they applied it to 2 specific locations. Then we also had our Adaptation Land Use Planning Guide, which was a guide for the county, but also our cities and towns to help us with our general plan updates. So it explains a little bit what kind of policies might be relevant to sea level rise planning and implementable. Now on the bay side in Marin County, which this map shows, we had a number of pilot projects that were already underway, either in planning or already constructed. And so that's shown here. What we didn't have that on the coast side though. We didn't have any projects already happening on the coast side. We had a project that County Parks was working on in Bolinas Lagoon, which is a great sea level rise planning project. And that was pretty much it. So we really wanted to ramp up there and make sure that we got some projects on the ground to see what was feasible and what wasn't. So you remember this slide that showed our little CSMART planning program now? Our program looks like this today. And over here on this side is the Tomales Bay Living Shoreline Feasibility Study. So that's part of a greater planning effort now in the area. All of those fit into the local coastal program. So along the lines of wanting pilot projects, the goals of the Tomales Bay Living Shoreline project are to provide flood and erosion protection for the natural and built environment, of course, to maintain public access and recreational opportunities, and to develop some conceptual designs for pilot projects. We also want to make sure that the knowledge that we develop in this project is applicable to future projects elsewhere. So for our project outreach, we really relied a lot on that initial groundwork in CSMART's history. And we pulled together the Coastal Communities Working Group. So now this is a group that advises us on all of our West Marin planning. It's comprised of representatives from environmental organizations and neighborhood associations, community planning groups, the Alliance for Coastal Marin Villages, and they designated members, and those members are active in those groups and also within their communities. And they meet with us regularly and hear updates about the project, and they take that information back to the public. So they take it back to their planning groups, their homeowners associations, their environmental organizations, and they keep them updated. And they also help us get the word out when we hold meetings for the greater public on our projects. So, you know, for this project, of course, we have public meetings and we will continue to have public meetings. We have such a huge attendance at these meetings, and it's in part because we have these very active community members who are out there helping us get the word out. And we also have a lot of regulatory agencies involved on the coast in permitting and permissions for projects. So we developed the West Marin Advisory Group, which we call the WestMag. So this is a group of those agencies, regulatory resource agencies, land management agencies that have jurisdiction in West Marin. So it includes federal, state, and even some county departments that are not the Community Development Agency, but say like county parks that hold property there. And then the technical advisory committees are specific to each project. So for example, for this project, we asked our consultant, ESA, Dane Behrens, the project manager, to identify people that they would want on their technical advisory committee to advise them as we move forward in the project. There's naturally overlap with the West Marin Advisory Group and the Technical Advisory Committee. There's some people that serve on both. And in fact, we have held one meeting where we had both groups together, which was really fruitful, by the way. Now, in terms of the permitting and permission challenges with all of these different agencies involved, one of the challenges is that we are located in a national marine sanctuary, and they are, with good reason, more restrictive than other places on the shoreline. Another is mitigation requirements. You know, generally for living shoreline projects, when you're enhancing existing habitat in order to provide long-term benefits, there's still going to be some impact to, well, there's likely going to be some impact to the existing habitat in order to get that long-term benefit. And the way that our laws and policies are now, you need to provide mitigation for this short-term impact, even if there is a long-term benefit. So that is a challenge, and it was a particular challenge in Tomales Bay, where there's a lot of eelgrass. I mean, that's a great thing, but there's a lot of eelgrass that goes very close to the shoreline. So we really had to work around that and think about ways that we could design projects and also meet mitigation requirements. Another challenge was oysters and aquaculture. The aquaculture that exists in Tomales Bay is done on specific leases that are leased for only that purpose. And one of the reasons for that is that they're non-native oysters. The oysters that we eat out of Tomales Bay are not native oysters to Tomales Bay. The Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, however, had done a native oyster restoration project where they actually identified sites with native, where native oyster restoration would be feasible. And so we did work with them to try to identify sites nearby or in locations where they had identified sites feasible for oysters, so we could leverage our efforts in those areas and leverage the habitat benefits as well. With the regulatory challenges and all of the different agencies involved, we wanted to make sure this project had a regulatory roadmap. ESA contracted with Brad Damitz, who I worked with to develop a regulatory roadmap. Brad came up with this amazing document that really takes us step by step through the process. He explains the permits and permissions required by each agency with jurisdiction in and on the shoreline of Tomales Bay, and identifies the steps to obtain those permits and permissions. He did that in two ways. He had a checklist document where you could go through and check off what you have done so far in the process. And he also laid out the steps in a schedule. So you can look at the schedule and go through and say, okay, so this is next. This is what I need to do to prepare for the next step. And the schedule walks you through that. I'll show you a quick sample. But this was reviewed by all of the agencies involved, and that is a remarkable achievement in and of itself, given the number of agencies that he was able to reach out to all of them and get their input. You know, these are people that have serious demands on their time. We feel very lucky to have this document in our arsenal as we move forward. Quickly, here are the steps that for part of this, the pre-construction and prior to issuance of permit steps. So the first one would be under the category of agency coordination and permitting. And the step would be to conduct pre-construction biological surveys as required by permits and submit reports. And who would do that? The consultants. And they would submit them to who? The California Coastal Conservancy, the Regional Water Quality Control Board. I can't see the rest because it's covered up by the webinar thing, but I think that's the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. That's how this works. And then there's columns to the side where you check off what's completed and what's not. And it really walks you through every single step. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Dane so he can tell you about the details of the project and how it's carried out.
Thanks, Leslie. Let's see, let me get this transferred over. Is it showing my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. Thanks for the great intro, Leslie. I think some of those threads will be really important going through this part, the sort of the technical part of this, because this is all, you know, this was started years ago with the C-SMART project and others, and we're sort of a continuation of that, and you know, moving in parallel to other projects, both in East Marin and in Bolinas and Stinson Beach. I wanted to give a little bit of I wanted to start with some geomorphic context, because I think this is going to be an underlying thread that covers a lot of the aspects of the project. And then I'll talk a little bit about sea level rise and living shorelines in our team, and then go into our approach. But I really wanted to cover this because, you know, Tomales Bay is a different animal than San Francisco Bay and from the open coast. It's a really unique site. It pretty much occupies the fault line here, and there's different plates on either side. So the geology is actually quite variable along the site, and it's moving. It's. I mean, you can say this about a lot of sites too, but the shoreline, it really is, it's not static. You look at this image and you see this sort of set of geographic locations, and you think of the places and place names and stuff like that. But really the shoreline is and has been moving for the last 150 years and adjusting to different changes. We have Walker Creek on the north side here near the mouth, Lagunitas Creek on the south side. This is the sort of the coastal entrance to the bay, and it's about 15 miles long. You get a lot of variation in wave conditions along the bay. It's more coastal swell on this side, more wind wave on the south end, on the inward end. The salinity changes quite a bit. The tides change quite a bit along the bay. And it's undergone a lot of history in terms of land use changes. And even though a lot of the historical grazing and logging that happened in the 1800s has subsided, there's still change along the shoreline. There's still structures along parts of the shoreline that maybe arrest sediment in some areas. You know, there's development along much of the shoreline. And so I just wanted to say that because it's really important to consider when we think about at the project scale, what's going to change both with and without the project. We want to understand as sea level rise progresses, what would happen if nothing were to happen, if there was no project. This map on here is from a paper from 1999, which I should have referenced here, that looks at the change in bathymetry over the last 150 years or so. It's kind of in grayscale, so it's hard to see, but so there are areas where the bay has deepened by several meters over the last 150 years, and areas where it's shallowed. And what we're seeing is that Walker Creek and Lagunitas Creek deltas are still pushing out. And on the site scale along the shore, there's quite a bit of change as well, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So add sea level rise to that framework, and it's actually quite complex what you see. This map on the left is from the Sea Smart study using Cosmos outputs to look at different areas that are flooded under different sea level rise scenarios, going purple being like no sea level rise, no storm. So just the channels inundated down by Point Reyes Station. And as you increase in sea level rise, you can see different areas are flooded. This provides some useful context for the study in terms of what we would expect to see with sea level rise if nothing were to happen to the existing shoreline. We also have a lot of on the ground information just from people posting videos and photos from king tides. I'll talk about this site again later. This is Martinelli Park. And this gives us kind of a surrogate for what sea level rise might look like. King tides are kind of give us an understanding of what would happen if tides were like maybe a foot higher. So I think a lot of folks on this call will probably be familiar now with the concepts of living shorelines, but I just want to touch on it quickly. There are a lot of ways to protect the shoreline, both from erosion and from flooding. And for a long time, traditional methods, gray infrastructure has been kind of the primary approach. And in the last several decades, so-called living shorelines have become more popular, both on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and now on the West Coast in the last few decades. Really, the idea is using naturally occurring features, so natural habitats that provide some level of protection for the shoreline already, and mimicking those, trying to reuse those types of features in an appropriate way, because in addition to providing some level of erosion and flooding protection, they also give a lot of other benefits. They provide habitat, recreation, aesthetics, carbon sequestration, and they both evolve over time, as you would expect, but they also, if designed properly, they can self-maintain in a way that would be hard to achieve with gray infrastructure. So I wanted to touch on our team a little bit. This is, it's been really exciting to work with this group. So this is a really interdisciplinary team because, Tomales Bay, again, is a very unique site. And so there's a lot of history in terms of how the development sphere overlaps with the natural habitat throughout the bay. There's a lot of different bases to cover, essentially. And so I won't go into detail on everyone's role, but I will talk throughout about what different folks have done. Essentially, this has been a really collaborative process over the last few years, working with biologists, ecologists, geomorphologists, and engineers, and public policy experts. And it's been kind of great. I mean, I will just say that, sea level rise is obviously a great challenge to all of us, but it's nice to work in a place where there's the political will to meet that challenge, and also where there's a lot of really talented people that are sort of at the top of their game that are thinking really hard on this. So it's been really great to work with all of these folks over the last few years. So I want to talk a little bit about our approach, and really, you know, our approach for trying to address the challenge of sea level rise with living shorelines. We're trying to build on a lot of the recent work that's been done just in the last 5 or 10 years. There's been a lot of advances inside San Francisco Bay and elsewhere. You know, one example is, you know, the sea level rise adaptation framework that Point Blue and the county and SFEI worked on, that has a lot of good examples from Marin County, that as to how you would develop a series of adaptation measures and how you would apply those to the landscape. There's also other work by SFEI, their adaptation atlas. There's work on the open coast that we worked on with TNC, the natural infrastructure guidelines. Really, we looked at all of these approaches and we tried to build on that and develop something specific for Tomales Bay, given the unique challenges here. Just briefly, what this generally looked like is that we started with a process of looking at what's the existing vulnerability. Then we looked at what are some of the things that might work? What are some of the living shorelines options that we might have? And how do we understand where those are suitable and where they're not? We went through a process of sort of collaboratively looking at how the sea level rise maps overlap with infrastructure, existing habitats that are sensitive, you know, vulnerable areas, and where might adaptation measures work within that framework. We did sort of a first screening to select 6 candidate sites as a group, and we kind of dug into those, went into more detail about what we were seeing at each site, and I'll show a map with those. More recently, we did a second level of screening, which kind of looked at finer detail, you know, what might be feasible and what might not be, looking ahead to the ultimate goal of the site, which is to look at feasibility of just a few sites. So we worked with the county and developed, the county ended up choosing 2 priority sites, which we will now work with in developing conceptual designs. And the level of design here is, you know, we want to look at mapping out quantities, costs, layouts, you know, how different options might mesh together, all the things that we would need to understand whether it's feasible to move forward with this type of approach in Tomales Bay. So to kind of give a sense of scale or image to what I mean when I say assessing vulnerability, we looked at a lot of things. So these colors on the background here, this is just for one site in the bay. We did these little maps throughout the whole shoreline and looked at these as a group. So these colors here show the bathymetry and topography. Blue is sort of subtidal, green and yellows are in the marsh area, and reds and browns are going to upland. These kind of give us some context for what's the sort of elevation capital that we have, like what are we looking at in terms of what sea level rise might impact first in the next 50 years or so. But we also looked at things like what areas are flooded under sea level rise. So this red line here on the boundary is the Cosmos, the 100-centimeter sea level rise scenario with the 20-year storm. And these red dots here are red polygons are buildings that would be flooded within those extents. We also looked at existing habitats. This meshed green area is eelgrass from the 2017 Merkel survey. And we looked at other things, developed areas, roads, areas with existing armoring. And also these dots here represent areas where we looked at erosion. So essentially what we did is we digitized some shorelines from the 1960s and also took some recent shorelines from around 2016 and looked at, sort of broad brush change along the shoreline. Pinker or redder dots would indicate erosion and bluer dots would indicate accretion in the long term. And we use this to understand sort of the large scale sediment movement patterns, which are important for understanding the baseline, but also to help us understand what areas are the most vulnerable to erosion in the long term. So that was the plot from the sort of the Cypress Grove area, which is a little bit less developed. We did this throughout the bay, and this is Marshall to kind of give you a sense of scale of the challenge here. Much of the bay is concentrated along the shoreline, the development and a lot of the habitats, to be honest, And so there's a pretty great challenge in terms of preservation here in the long term, because even with 3 feet of sea level rise, you see quite a bit of erosion risk and also incremental flooding risk. This is the Marshall area just south. And I'll talk about, I showed just 2 eastern shore sites. I am going to talk about Martinelli Park in the West Shore a little bit later, because there's a couple developed sites of this bay, and a high difficulty on both. And so you see a lot of areas where that boundary of sea level rise flooding is either essentially on the edge of the existing roadway, whether that's Sir Francis Drake or Highway 1, depending on which side you're on. And in many cases also in sort of the developed areas that either overhang or occupy parts of the seaward portion of the shoreline, seaward of the road. So how did we go about identifying adaptation measures? And this is where this project was kind of fun, actually. This is not San Francisco Bay. This is not the open coast. This is a very unique site with its own habitats, its own features, its own hydrology and coastal conditions. And so we try to follow some of the same processes that others have done. And so we looked at first delineating the shoreline into groups, because even though this bay has its own set of behaviors as a whole, there's also a lot of microclimates, microgeologies that really affect the local habitats and opportunities. So we kind of broke the bay down into different units. We developed a series of adaptation measures based on reference sites that we were seeing in the bay. This image here on the left shows some features that you see less of in San Francisco Bay, but quite a bit of in Tomales Bay, which are these nice boulders offshore of these eroding bluff areas that create these nice Tombolo beaches, and sometimes beaches fronting marshes. That's a feature we saw a lot of. That's kind of not unique to Tomales Bay, but we see a lot of it. So we developed a list of measures and considered really what are the feasibility of, like, what are the needs of those measures for them to be, what makes them appropriate or not appropriate throughout the bay. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We developed a list of measures, and then we looked at what are the sort of the suitability criteria for those and how might they be feasible in different areas of the bay. So to kind of give that an illustration, this is showing the bay flipped to a west-east kind of orientation, or left to right rather. And I think the scope of this study, it would be hard to dig into very high detail throughout all 30 or so miles of the shoreline. But I think it was helpful to go through this process on a broad scale and look at what areas are kind of distinct in terms of things like geology and hydrology and habitats. So this map here shows sort of these different regions we were looking at on a broad brush scale. This map here shows the corresponding geology. And again, we're looking at 2 separate continental plates here with different levels of crumbliness of sediment delivery, just different constraints to consider. We also went through and looked at a lot of different habitat maps under existing conditions. Really important, just as kind of the background context here, because we're not just looking at preserving infrastructure, but also sensitive habitats along the shoreline. This is an eelgrass map mapped out by Merkel's group in 2017. We also really tapped into the talent on the team. Ted and Shayla worked on the subtidal habitats for many, many years. And Point Blue and others really understand the shoreline and its habitats. So we use a lot of publicly available maps, and also kind of tapped into our sort of the expert knowledge on our team and from the public. And beyond looking at maps, we also sort of ground truth by going through the shoreline and really just picking out, using images like this one from the California Coastal Records Project. Looking at what does the shoreline look like? So where do we see places that have armor? Where do we see places that have development? Existing features like this Tombolo Beach here at Strauss Beach, groins, things like that, just to kind of ground truth. What's our baseline for the shoreline? What does it look like right now? And so that was a really important thing to go through because, again, this is sort of the context that we live in for our starting point, and also helps us understand what might the baseline look like in 30 years if nothing happened, if there was no project, and what would happen with just sea level rise. It's important to understand what the backshore looks like. So this map kind of shows in different colors areas of rocky shoreline, areas of existing armoring, unprotected marsh edge in green. There's a lot of remnant railroad berm. That's these white areas. There's a lot of legacy here in terms of how people have used the land over time, that we're working within that context. And there are other features to this, but I just kind of wanted to talk about the fact that we mapped out the shoreline and tried to make a concerted effort to understand the baseline. So these are some kind of nice aerial images from that Keith Merkel and his group took, I think as part of their 2017 eelgrass mapping efforts. Just to say again that when we were looking at developing adaptation measures, we really tried to learn from what was at the site now. What are some of the existing habitats that are unique to Tomales Bay that already provide some level of protection of the shoreline? And so the list that we ended up kind of coalescing on included several different types of features. Subtidal features like nearshore reefs and aquatic vegetation like eelgrass. But also there were some features that are separate from what you see in maybe for San Francisco Bay, like tidal flat augmentation as opposed to just mud flat augmentation, because you see a lot of sand in Tomales Bay in different parts of it. We also looked at a new group of habitats called rocky intertidal that we're calling it. We looked at several different types of beaches. And one, again, that I touched on earlier is this sort of Tombolo Beach. Tombolo is just a beach that forms behind an obstruction, like a boulder or something like that. It's just kind of a really important feature to Tomales Bay that you see along different parts of the shoreline. Another one that's, I think, will be a key one that we'll be looking at going forward is this sort of creek to bay connection. A lot of people have talked about that in San Francisco Bay and elsewhere, just because sediment is going to be really important to the overall long-term planning effort for sea level rise. And their sediment is sort of a thing that can be unlocked from a system in some places. You have Highway 1 on the eastern shore and Sir Francis Drake on the western shore. And you have a lot of culverts under that Caltrans and the county have to maintain. And you have a lot of trapped sediment, and it might be important to look at, can you unlock that? Can you reopen those connections? Can you reuse some of that sediment in a beneficial way? So these are just some other pictures, kind of just trying to provide some understanding of what we mean when we talk about some of these different features. So this is Martinelli Park with that shipwreck again. This is an example of a tidal marsh. It's actually fronted by a beach on this side. And one point I want to make, much like as you might have seen in the adaptation atlas, is that these types of things work together. We're not trying to look at any one adaptation in a vacuum. We're trying to understand that habitats are complex and they interweave and intermesh, and they work best that way. And so you often see several types of features working together in the natural environment. This here on the left is an example of kind of that rocky intertidal. That's a kind of a unique adaptation that we're seeing in Tomales Bay. So speaking of that, we followed a similar path to sort of trying to describe and understand these adaptation measures as others have done. And so we developed these sort of kind of two-pagers that try to summarize what's the definition of this type of feature. So this is the rocky intertidal. What kind of risks might it be appropriate for? So maybe storm surge and erosion for certain tide levels. And what are the tide levels where it might be effective? And what are some of the ecosystem services that would provide? And what impact would that have on the shoreline? So we're trying to provide this kind of baseline context and go through a similar process that others have done, but recognize that this is a unique location. And that's one of the ways that we're trying to help advance this kind of living shorelines practice, is to kind of use similar frameworks and apply them in this case. And so I really want to touch on also that it was important to think about the suitability for each type of measure. And so we looked at what are the coastal conditions, the hydrologic conditions, the elevations, things like that you would need to consider if you were to try to place a certain type of adaptation. So a lot of this happened in the first year of the project, trying to understand how to place certain things. So once we had done that, once we looked at adaptation measures, we had looked at overlay maps that showed areas that might be vulnerable, we started to, we put those together again, and we started to map out areas that might be feasible for different types of features. So these like dashed lines here show where we kind of sketched out where maybe a coarse beach could be relevant or could be useful. And there are several different, again, there was a broad list of things that we were looking at. This is just showing a couple of applications of a couple different things, but we looked throughout the bay and we looked at where different things might be appropriate. So the next step was to identify candidate sites, and we looked at those maps on a broad scale, existing habitats, areas where there's armoring, areas where there's flooding. These yellow diamond areas are areas that were flagged by the Tomales Bay Native Oyster Restoration Working Group as preferred sites for looking further at oyster restoration. We looked at all these things and we found 3 general areas that had a lot of potential for living shorelines, and met the and we felt on a broad scale met some of the project goal and objectives. So we developed 7 candidate sites. So these were on the eastern shore: Hamlet, Nix Cove, Cypress Grove, Marshall, Marconi, 2 alternate locations on Tomasini Point, and on the west shore in Inverness, Martinelli Park. I won't have time to go through all of those in detail, but I'm going to talk about the 2 that were selected in the end by the county. But before we got to those 2, we did a second level of screening, and dug in more detail and looked at what are some of the potential ecological benefits and also trade-offs. I mean, if you were to place one type of feature, you have to consider, are there impacts for that as well? We looked at how many approaches might be appropriate at different sites that could help with the long-term feasibility, and we looked at a lot of different factors. Things like what's the longevity of the project, and sort of engineering factors like cost and constructability in the long term, because in the long term, this has to be, we're looking at feasibility here. And if this is going to be outrageously expensive or not appropriate, or if we look at the baseline with sea level rise without a project and this doesn't provide much improvement, then we wouldn't want to move forward with it. So that we went through this process and developed sort of a memorandum as a team. And the county, with that information, selected 2 sites. The first one was Cypress Grove and Livermore Marsh. To give a little bit of historical context for this one, I've got about 5 more slides here. So as I was saying before, this is a moving shoreline. The whole bay really is, but you see it really exemplified in a few locations, and this being one of them. This is that railroad berm along the eastern shore that 100 years ago was already changing the landscape. It was causing sediment to trap behind here and create this marsh. This was breached in the 80s and again in the 90s, creating a tidal connection here. And you can see that there used to be this sort of beach fronting this peninsula here, Cypress Grove, with a marsh behind it, and that has since eroded in the last 30 years. And a lot of things have changed. That's sort of a really simplified overlook, but what we're seeing is that in general, things are moving kind of south along the shore. The dominant wave direction is from the north. And this whole peninsula is moving, and you can see that this development is owned by the Ottawa Canyon Ranch folks. Their development is locked in place, which you often see with development, whereas the landscape is moving around it. And so really the issues that they're facing are erosion on this northern edge, but also flooding from high tides and run up. So to give some pictures of that from a recent site visit, this is what that western edge looks like. It's kind of a sheer face with ice plant hanging over it and some riprap and this sort of former wooden retaining wall for rocks. And you can kind of see the sense of the scale of where there are pockets of erosion. This boulder here is what used to lock in place a beach along this kind of front here with a marsh behind it. So really quickly, just to talk about what we're thinking about, I don't want to go in these in detail and bog this down, but looking at the site, we sat down with the team. and we looked at what are some opportunities that we might consider. We sketched out a lot of different things that we might want to consider more. And what we're doing now for the conceptual design phase is we're digging into these more and seeing what might work and what might not. But we're thinking of several things, and these are covering the whole gradient from subtidal to supertidal, looking at potentially unlocking sediment from the upper watershed. Could that be used to supplement, to create a feeder beach in this location, which could allow collection of sediment behind this existing boulder? Would it be appropriate to maybe place other rocky material which could potentially provide substrate for habitat, but also lock in place sediment along this shore to create kind of a softer shoreline that will be more adaptive over time? Could this be paired with something at the toe like oyster restoration, either low or high profile, something that would be learning from the LSP 1 and 2 sites in San Francisco Bay? So this is something that we would be working with Ted and Shayla on. We also have to work within the context of existing eelgrass. And so we've got Keith and Waylon on our team working with us on that. And there are many different types of features here. I don't want to go into detail on all of them, but really, I just want to talk about the fact that we are looking at several different things. And for this design phase, we're going to be trying to advance these enough to the point where we can say, what is the cost? What are the habitat trade-offs? Is there a benefit to the projects for the shoreline as related to or relative to the baseline with no project? And, you know, is this something that's feasible enough that we should move forward with, or should the county move forward with over time and investigate more? I don't think I have much time to talk about Martinelli Park, which is the other site we're looking at, but I will give some of the historical context. This is a really interesting site. It's actually pushed out onto the bay over the last 150 years, possibly due to logging impacts in the upper watershed. And it's really interesting. This shipwreck showed up several decades ago, and the natural sediment movement southward collected behind the shipwreck and formed a beach fronting this sort of brackish, salty marsh here. But this channel is kind of locked in place in the center of this platform now by these two kind of short berms here. And there's development on this platform. So there's a lot of private ownership here, but this is also de facto one of the kind of the better public parks in the bay. This is probably the most popular Instagram spot. People park here and walk out to the shipwreck. And so that's the other piece of context here is we're not looking at just preserving parts of the shoreline and its habitats. We're also looking at, can we preserve and enhance public access and recreation in the long term to the extent that it's feasible. So I won't go into detail on the aspects of this one, but I just wanted to give a broad overview of what are the types of things we're looking at. We're trying to look at ways of unlocking sediment, enhancing existing habitats, and working with existing habitats and existing adaptation measures that we've developed for Tomales Bay to try to see if we can mitigate flooding and erosion on the shorefront. I don't want to spend much time on these, but we have a similar map showing what are the different adaptation measures we might consider here. And so I think I will move on unless there are questions on that. So that we have time for questions. So I just want to say thank you to everyone that showed up for this. It's an interesting project, and we're very early in it. This is the sort of the feasibility phase, and so there will be a lot more time to talk to a lot of folks about it. So thank you.
Thank you very much for both your presentations. There are no questions right now in the chat, so feel free to use, if anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to put it in the chat and I will direct them. But I have a question. I was really curious about some of the best practices that both of you have experienced for that inclusive community engagement throughout the lifespan of a Living Shoreline project.
Some of the best practices for public engagement. I think I think the best practice is to continually engage the public. So, you know, in a project like this, you'll have your public meetings laid out and scoped. So for this project, there are 3 public meetings. But you also have to make sure that you're continually going back and forth with the public. So for us, that's the role that the Coastal Communities Working Group really plays, is we meet with them more frequently. There's a lot of intensive work that goes into planning a full-on public meeting. With the Coastal Communities Working Group, we can meet with them frequently. They can go back and forth to their communities. So that continual engagement, I think, is really important for any project, and getting making sure that that the public has those opportunities for public input is really crucial. And there's a couple projects on the Bay side right now in Marin County that are suffering because they've had some late public input. These are sea level rise adaptation projects, and it's really disrupted the flow of the project. So, and in one case, pretty much killed the project. So it's unfortunate. So we want to keep that going.
Yeah, definitely.
And I will say too, just that one thing that was really helpful for us was in our first meeting, you know, with the coastal working, or sorry, with the, you know, with members of the community here and stakeholders last February. It was really great to have the county set up, you know, poster boards of different areas of the Bay, and people were just putting up sticky notes of like where they live, but also where they've seen issues. And it's been really great to get kind of really active public engagement on this project, because number one, it helps us understand what people are concerned about, but number two, it also gives us a lot of really good information that, like, you know, Cosmos is really great for showing like sea level rise maps on a broad scale. It's also great to get really great ground truthing. You know, somebody says, hey, my culvert flooded, you know, last winter or something. Things like that are super valuable. And so it's been really great to get that sort of engagement directly with the public.
Yeah, definitely. And this next question is related to public engagement. When would be the next opportunity for public participation in the project?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and I should have come more prepared. I should have actually looked at the schedule. So I think the next, I think, and I'm not going to say for sure because I didn't look at the schedule, but I think it's this summer. We're having another public meeting.
I think it was the October, September timeframe.
Awesome. Okay, the next question. Thanks for the presentation. Can you clarify your shoreline planning objectives related along with assessing the cost and trade-offs? Will you be assessing the equity effects or distribution of cost and benefits for different opportunities?
I think that, so I showed a lot of different options. I think that the way that we're going to ultimately do this is combine several of those into you know, a conceptual design that includes several features. I don't know if we're going to go through like every single alternative possibility. I think that we would probably want to coalesce them into one or two at each site. But the plan is to understand, so we have a task for looking at how the baseline, what are the baseline conditions with sea level rise without the project, and where do we see flooding? And what are the conditions with the project? And that includes several of those components. And where do we see flooding under that scenario? And we have, you know, mapped on all of this are the properties that are, you know, the parcels that are impacted. And so there's a lot of really good information from the county, not just in terms of ownership, but also in you know, public access to these areas, that we were hoping to have a good understanding of which areas are impacted and which are not. based on this understanding. I don't know if that fully answers the question. I'm trying to remember all the parts of it.
Yeah, it was, it was a pretty segmented question.
I would say that I'm remembering that there was an objectives part. I think specifically we're looking for ways that we can mitigate erosion and flooding as kind of a first order thing. And so in terms of flooding, we'll be looking at high tides and wave run up kind of superimposed on these maps with the adaptations laid on. And so if you have a series of adaptations going from, let's say, maybe oysters or eelgrass in the offshore connecting to something on the shoreline, maybe marsh restoration or beach, if you take all those together and look at wave run up at the shoreline behind all of that, is it a foot lower, you know, than you get with sea level rise and no adaptations? Is it half a foot lower? We're going to be looking at, can we specifically mitigate erosion and flooding?
And then I think the second half of the question was assessing the equity effects and distribution of cost and benefits of different opportunities.
Yeah, I think this part of the project is pretty technical in nature. We don't have, I mean, the biggest equity component in this project is in the objective of searching for sites that have public benefits that we want to enhance. So sites like Martinelli Park, where the public comes, they use the site, it's free, it's available. Similarly with Cypress Grove, it's not an open public access site, but the Audubon Canyon Ranch does a fair amount of outreach, and the research that they do is for the public benefit. So that's the biggest equity component at this phase in the project, but if the project were to go on further, if we get another grant to fund the next phase of the project, I think the equity component would be much larger in that phase.
Yeah, it's hard to know without having a plan with things on the ground. So I think we're getting there.
Awesome. Last question, and I think that may be the last of the day. How are you making these projects green job projects?
I would say that it's too early in this project to really make anything a green project. This is a feasibility study, so it's really about figuring out if the project's even doable given the geomorphology and the topography and other factors. So
Awesome. Okay, and one more question before. What is your approach to modeling the fuel reduction effects of these projects?
That's something that we probably have to think about. We haven't gone that far yet. I think that, so to kind of help clarify on the level of the design, I think we're at a phase where we're going to sketch things out to a level where we can understand quantities and costs. We are going to be thinking about how things might be constructed, and so that would get into like things like that. But I think that we could probably provide those numbers at like an early level, and I think if the projects do look to be feasible, or at this phase at least, you know, as we get to things like the 30% design, the 60% design farther down, and those are things where there would still be opportunities to modify the design, you know, considering aspects like that, once we have something more that we can chew on.
Yeah, I love these questions. They're very very robust and thorough in their sustainability approach. So this project is great.
Well, that is all we have time for today. I just want to thank you both again for giving this wonderful presentation. If it is okay, there are a few more questions that I missed in the chat. Would they be able to direct their questions to your email?
Of course.
Okay. Thank you again, and I hope everyone in the audience learned something today. I certainly learned how dynamic the Tomales Bay ecosystem is, and thank you all, and you should get the presentation recording in an email soon. Great. Bye. Thank you.